President Higgins, Mrs. Higgins, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, you're very welcome this evening to Trinity College on really, I think, what is a very auspicious occasion, which is the inaugural Edmund Burke Lecture, which is going to be entitled, What Would Edmund Burke Think of Human Rights? And will be delivered by Baroness Onora O'Neill. This is, as you're all very aware, part of the President of Ireland's Ethics Initiative. The President of Ireland's Ethics Initiative is really a centrepiece of the President's agenda for 2014, and it's focused on raising the level, quality, and intensity of public debate on some of the most pressing ethical issues of our day. The 7 universities and the Royal Irish Academy have been invited to lead this initiative, and through a range of events that are really intended to be public-facing, to engage the public, to prompt discussion and debate on the future of our society, on the values that we ought to promote, and on the responsibilities of citizens in this global age. As a result, over 50 events will take place across Ireland in the coming months, all of which will put ethical concerns centre stage in our deliberations. And here in Trinity, already this year, we've had some really exciting and energising debates on synthetic biology and the future of human life, and most recently on cyber ethics and all of the responsibilities and challenges that come with living in this global age. It's very fitting that this inaugural Edmund Burke Lecture really anchors the President of Ireland's Ethics Initiative here in Trinity. Edmund Burke, as many of you will be aware, graduated from Trinity in 1748. As a student, he founded what would later become the college's Historical Society, which is the oldest student society in the world. And Burke's life and work as a public intellectual has had a deep and lasting impact here in Trinity, but also in Ireland and certainly in Europe. John Henry Foley's statue of Edmund Burke, which is positioned at the college's main entrance and in the heart of the city, is really also a testament to his leading position among Trinity graduates. And to mark the legacy and impact of Edmund Burke, the Trinity Long Room Hub has instituted this annual Edmund Burke Lecture, which is to be delivered by a leading public intellectual each year and on a topic that engages with many of the challenges facing us today. I would expect that Burke would have approved of this lecture tonight, although he may have looked a little askance at the title and would be, I guess, intrigued to know what exactly is intended there. My colleague, Professor Barkhoff, has the privilege of introducing our eminent speaker this evening, but I want to add my voice of appreciation to Baroness Onora O'Neill, who honours us this evening with her presence for what will be undoubtedly a characteristically insightful and intriguing lecture. Before I finish, I'd like also to acknowledge with sincere gratitude the support that's being provided for the annual Edmund Burke Lecture through a generous endowment in honour of the late Pádraig Fallon, which is provided by his family, and we're really pleased that his family can be here this evening as well. So I'd like to pass over to the director of the Trinity Long Room Hub, Professor Juergen Barkhoff, who will introduce the speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Provost, President Higgins, Mrs. Higgins, Baroness O'Neill, Gillian Fallon, members of the family of Pádraig Fallon, Vice Provost, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great pleasure and privilege now to welcome you all on behalf of the Trinity Long Room Hub, our Arts and Humanities Research Institute. It is a special privilege to have you, President Higgins, among us tonight. As an institute, we have this ambition to contribute to debates that form the intellectual climate of our time and influence the course of our society in a modest way. And with this ambition in mind, it was an enormous opportunity for us to be invited by the President to contribute to his ethics initiative. We had just decided to institute the annual Edmund Burke Lecture in memory of one of Trinity College's most famous and most influential graduates. And when your call went out to the universities to lead a new debate on ethics, we felt that there could be no better way to do this than to invite one of the leading moral philosophers of our time, Baroness Onora O'Neill, to speak about Edmund Burke and what his ideas can mean for us today. Edmund Burke was not only a formidable statesman, but also a leading intellectual in many fields, such as history, political philosophy, economics, and aesthetics. During the Enlightenment, his ideas challenged and changed paradigms, and they continue to be immensely influential to this very day, both in academic scholarship and in public discourse. During his own time, the academic disciplines were not yet as clearly delineated as today, and Burke is a wonderful example of the kind of versatile, intellectual Enlightenment man whose penetrating spirit of inquiry accepts no limits. He also was the kind of thinker that was not content with pure thought or abstract theories, but who in his intellectual pursuits was driven by the desire to make a difference in society and to people's lives, and who employed his gifts as a brilliant rhetorician to this end. For us today, these are central goals too for scholarship in the fields Burke's work spans: interdisciplinarity that transcends the boundaries of academic subjects, because the problems of today do not fit into disciplines, and research that articulates how it can make a difference to society. So, for this reason, as the Vice Provost mentioned, we have instituted this annual Edmund Burke Lecture. One of his central and lifelong concerns was the question what moral codes should underpin the social order and inform our behavior as responsible citizens. Again and again, he returned to the question how the individual exercises moral responsibility towards the community, its institutions, traditions, and practices. Burke was convinced that the realization and exercise of our individual rights, that in the exercise of these we needed to be mindful of the societal framework that molds us and carries us, and that our rights need to be balanced, carefully balanced by our obligations. This is today at least as important as it was in Burke's time, and we hope that the Edmund Burke Lectures will help to keep his manifold legacies alive. As the Vice Provost mentioned, the annual Edmund Burke Lectures are generously supported by an endowment of the Fallon family in honor of the late Porrick Fallon, one of Trinity's more recent distinguished graduates who, like Burke, left TCD for London to make his mark. It is my great pleasure to welcome tonight his wife, Gillian, his daughter, Nicola, his brothers, Brian and Ivan Fallon, and many members and friends of the Fallon family. Educated at Blackrock College and Trinity College, where he graduated in business studies in 1969, Porrick Fallon moved to London as a journalist, where he pioneered a new kind of financial journalism, focusing on the banking and financial markets. And as executive chairman of Euromoney Institutional Investors for nearly 30 years, he was responsible for building from very modest beginnings one of the world's leading international publishing, events, and electronic information groups. As a great stylist in his own domain, he shared with Edmund Burke a passion for writing and for finding the most fitting and most effective word. The insistence on high-quality journalism in every respect was a hallmark of all his business ventures. Porrick Fallon was a man of many talents and interests, and in his later life he wrote a number of books. The last one, which has not yet been published, showed a remarkable proximity to one of Edmund Burke's lifelong concerns. It is on free trade and the First World War, and precisely this question of the relationship between war and free trade also exercised the young Whig politician in the mid-18th century, and he argued passionately in many forms against coercion and the use of force in the conflicts with the American colonies, and for the alternative of mutual beneficial trade, free trade. We are very grateful for the Fallon family for the generous support of this lecture series, and hope that the annual Edmund Burke Lecture will also keep the memory of Porrick Fallon and his contributions to public life in Ireland, the UK, and beyond alive. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now my great pleasure to introduce to you tonight's most distinguished speaker, Professor Onora O'Neill, one of the leading voices both in academia and public discourse on questions of ethics today. Professor O'Neill comes from Northern Ireland and has combined a highly distinguished academic career as a philosopher with a broad variety of important public functions and positions, mainly in Britain and the US. She was principal of Newnham College, Cambridge from 1992 to 2006, president of the British Academy from 2005 to 2009, chaired the Nuffield Foundation from 1998 to 2010, and has been a crossbench member of the House of Lords since 2000 as Baroness O'Neill of Bengarve. She currently chairs the UK's Equality and Human Rights Commission. Professor O'Neill has written widely on a broad array of ethical issues: the practical philosophy of Immanuel Kant, political philosophy, on poverty and justice, on bioethics, media ethics, and most famously, on trust, trustworthiness, and accountability. Of her many books, I just mentioned the best known and most influential one, A Question of Trust, which was the subject of the BBC Reith Lectures in 2002. Those of us here tonight who are from within academia are increasingly asked to measure and objectify the impact our work has beyond specialist circles. And we do want to know. Of course, Professor O'Neill does not have to worry about that at all, but here is an impressive statistics nevertheless. Her TED Talk on trust has been downloaded more than 1.1 million times. Professor O'Neill, we are deeply grateful that you have accepted our invitation to come here to deliver the inaugural Edmund Burke Lecture as part of the President's Ethics Initiative. May I now invite you to speak to us on what would Edmund Burke think of human rights?
President, Mrs. Higgins, members of the Fallon family, members of the university, ladies and gentlemen, it is a real pleasure to be back at Trinity and also a pleasure to write and think on Edmund Burke, a change for me, as I have, of course, read and taught Edmund Burke, but I've never written specifically on Burke until these last few weeks. But it's proved a great pleasure. I was interested in the question, what was his take on rights, and specifically, what would his take be on the modern version, human rights? And I don't think the answer is at all simple. He took, as you all know, a surprising, often complex view of the revolutionary movements of his day and of their claims about rights. In many writings, he celebrates natural rights and the constitutions that respect and further them. But in other writings, as you also know, he excoriates what he calls abstract rights and those who claim and pursue them. So he seems to stand on both sides of the fence. In the 1760s and 1770s, as we've already heard, he argued for conciliation with the American revolutionaries. He also wrote scathingly about the oppression of Catholics in Ireland, and he attacked the abuses of the East India Company. In each case, he comments on the injustice of what was being done, on the need to protect the rights of the oppressed, and he argues for reform. But then, in the 1790s, he castigated the revolutionaries of France and their commitment to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen of 1789. And across more than 2 centuries, Burke's admirers and his critics have repeatedly discussed this tension, some, I have to say, at very considerable length. But, and this I find interesting, they have not reached a consensus about where he stood. So I have a view about where he stood, which I'll tell you, but there is no consensus. And I think to understand why this remains an interesting topic, it's good to hear some of Burke's admirers and critics at the time and what they said about him. The charge of inconsistency was set out trenchantly by William Hazlitt, who greatly admired Burke, but he wrote an essay with the very pointed title, The Character of Mr. Burke. And there he writes, I quote, "It's not without reluctance that we speak of the vices and infirmities of such a mind as Burke's, but the poison of high example has by far the widest range of destruction. And for the sake of public honor and individual integrity, we think it right to say that however it may be defended upon other grounds, the political career of that eminent individual has no title to the praise of consistency. Mr. Burke, the opponent of the American War, and Mr. Burke, the opponent of the French Revolution, are not the same person, but opposite persons, not opposite persons only, but deadly enemies. In the latter period, he abandoned not only all his practical conclusions, but all the principles on which they were founded. He proscribed all his former sentiments, denounced all his former friends, rejected and reviled all the maxims to which he had formerly appealed as incontestable. The burden of all his speeches on the American War was conciliation, concession, timely reform, and of course trade, as the only practicable or desirable alternative of rebellion. But the object of all his writings on the French Revolution was to deprecate and explode all concession and all reform as encouraging rebellion as an irretrievable step to revolution and anarchy, and much more to the same effect." End of quote from Hazlitt. But others, notably Wordsworth, claimed that Burke had indeed changed his mind for very good reasons when the French Revolution ran to excess. So did exactly the same. I won't quote you Wordsworth's poem, it's in the end of the prelude, where he says, Burke changed his mind, and he was completely right to do so. And others, notably Coleridge, argued that Burke had done no more than to rely on the same principles in differing circumstances, thereby legitimately reaching differing conclusions. So fundamental consistency, but applied to different cases. From principles exactly the same, he said, Burke could draw practical inferences almost opposite in differing situations. Now, these disagreements about Burke's claims and positions persist. If you read the Burke literature of the last 50 years, you find people continuing to disagree about his position. Was he a friend or an enemy of rights, including human rights, and what's the evidence? Now, although it is hard to demonstrate consistency among Burke's many, many comments on rights, it seems to me that he is committed both to rights and to their institutionalization. This is already clear, I think, in his 1780s speech on Mr. Fox's East India Bill, and there he says, I quote, "The rights of men, that is to say, the natural rights of mankind, are indeed sacred things. And if any public measure is proved mischievously to affect them, the objection ought to be fatal to that measure, even if no charter at all could be set up against it." But he then goes on to say that to have institutions that realize these sacred rights is still better. I quote again, "If these natural rights are further affirmed and declared by express covenants, if they are clearly defined and secured against chicane, against power and authority, by written instruments and positive engagements, they are in still better condition. They partake not only of the sanctity of the object so secured, but of that solemn public faith itself which secures an object of such importance. These things, secured by these instruments, may, without any deceitful ambiguity, be very fitly called the chartered rights of men." End quote. Now, these claims suggest that Burke might well have endorsed many of the human rights that now command wide assent, including those listed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 and the European Convention on Human Rights of 1950, and that he would also have argued for these rights to be institutionalized, or, as he so nicely puts it, chartered, and thereby secured against chicane, against power and authority by written instruments and positive engagements. We've got quite a lot of those. Now, although he might have had misgivings about one or another specific right, which is now taken to be important, the core of contemporary views of human rights would, I think, have appealed to him. If this is plausible, his position isn't wholly remote from the one that was developed in the two great international covenants of rights of 1966. Mind you, they use far more pedestrian language. They take on the task of securing respect for and realization of human rights. These covenants offered something of an answer to people who had feared that the Universal Declaration had merely proclaimed what are sometimes called manifesto rights or aspirations, in effect abstract rights, and had said much too little about realizing the rights. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of that year demands that each state, I quote, respect and ensure to all individuals within its territory and subject to its jurisdiction the rights recognized, and that it promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and freedoms, end quote. The International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights demands that each state party seek what is called, it's become a term of art, the progressive realization of economic, social and cultural rights to the maximum of its available resources. Since then, the duties of the states party to these covenants have been extended and extended. The covenants, however, say remarkably little about the duties either of individuals or of non-state institutions. Their focus is on the definition, assignment, and enforcement by states. Contemporary views of human rights do not, it seems, assume that rights can be realized in any circumstances whatsoever, but they do rely on a quite specific statist account of the circumstances that are required to secure respect for and realization of rights. Now to Burke's criticism of rights, which is a criticism of abstraction. His much richer account of the realization of rights is in large measure developed in the course of criticizing what he calls abstract rights, and contrasting them with views of rights that pay due attention to what he calls circumstances. He articulated this thought already in the 1760s and 70s, when he described the American revolutionaries as entitled to and maintaining the historical and acknowledged rights of Englishmen, rather than as making any claim about abstract rights. In 1775, so before the American independence, he wrote, "First, the people of the colonies are descendants of Englishmen. They are therefore not only devoted to liberty, but to liberty according to English ideas and on English principles. Abstract liberty, like other mere abstractions, is not to be found." Here he contrasts the so-called abstract liberties with the liberties of particular societies and communities. And although his comments are about liberties, rather than more broadly about rights, this is hardly surprising. The Constitution of the United States did not initially include explicit commitments to individual rights. They became explicit only when the first 10 amendments, known collectively as the Bill of Rights, were added to the Constitution with some other amendments. These amendments, and indeed actually in 1789 and then ratified, these amendments seem to promulgate abstract rights of the very type that Burke had criticized in his comment of the French revolutionaries. And that is indeed how the rights asserted in the US Bill of Rights are quite often now seen in the US. They're seen now as rights that have, as it were, been inserted on top of, rather than derived from, a living constitutional tradition. This is, for example, something that President George W. Bush said at the rededication of the archive where these documents are kept, the Rotunda for the Charters of Freedom in Washington, D.C. This is 2003. Quote, "The true revolution was not to defy one earthly power, but to declare principles that stand above every earthly power, the equality of each person before God, and the responsibility of government to secure the rights of all." Did Burke, one wonders, ever have second thoughts about the American revolutionaries with whom he had sympathized in 1776? Might he have come to think that in agreeing to the Bill of Rights, they too had fallen under the spell of abstract rights? And if not, what was the difference? Or would Burke have concluded that the circumstances in which American rights and liberties had been promulgated, including the rule of law, the common law, and a shared political tradition, meant that these were no mere abstract rights? By contrast, we find Burke's criticisms of abstract rights throughout his famous reflections on the Revolution in France and in many other writings, and these are fierce and sustained criticisms. He criticized the revolutionaries of France for their reckless assertion of the abstract rights to be found in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, and for their failure to respect and build on the ancient constitutional traditions and laws of France, which they could have done but did not do. He wrote, "I flatter myself that I love a manly, moral, regulated liberty as well as any gentleman of that society, be he who he will, and perhaps I have given as good proofs of my attachment to that cause in the whole course of my public conduct. I think I envy liberty as little as they do to any other nation, but I cannot stand forward and give praise or blame to anything which relates to human actions and human concerns on a simple view of the object, as it stands stripped of every relation, in all the nakedness and solitude of metaphysical abstraction. Circumstances, which with some gentlemen pass for nothing, give in reality to every political principle its distinguishing colour and discriminating effect. The circumstances are what render every civil and political scheme beneficial or noxious to mankind." End of quote. Now, in arguing that circumstances may render specific ways of institutionalizing rights either beneficial or noxious, I think Burke may have something useful to tell us. I think we can see parts of what Burke had in mind in asserting that the circumstances of the American and French revolutions differed. But it is less clear why he identifies the problem with French claims about the rights of man as arising from them being abstract. To abstract is simply to omit or leave out or bracket some features of whatever we are discussing. It's therefore unavoidable in all uses of language, and we can't make every feature or aspect of the matters we discuss explicit. So what's wrong about an account of liberties or rights that is stripped of every relation in all the nakedness and solitude of metaphysical abstraction? Speech may be, of course, more or less abstract. It may abstract from some features of a situation, not from others, but all speech is abstract in countless ways. Burke, like many later writers, including famously Hegel in criticizing Kant, who criticized claims about rights and liberalism for being abstract, must surely have some more specific defect in mind. It's not just abstraction that's the problem, but what is it? There are, I think, there's more than one possibility. Some critics of abstraction suggest that problems arise not so much because certain claims are, strictly speaking, abstract, in that they leave out some things, but because they smuggle in idealized, hence false claims. For example, many social and economic theories, as we know, assume idealized models of man or of rationality, which we don't find in real life. Idealizations make fictitious, indeed false, rather than merely abstract assumptions, and that's a good reason for being cautious about them. But this is not the failing of which Burke accuses the defenders of abstract rights. Other critics of abstraction suggest that the problem isn't that misleading, indeed false idealizations are covertly introduced, but that a misleading impression is given by omitting important or material aspects of the matter at hand. And this, I think, is closer to what worries Burke. The danger in focusing exclusively on an abstract account of rights is that we may omit some of the circumstances that really matter, and he thinks that they include the existing constitutions, conventions, traditions, habits, duties, virtues, and sentiments of human societies and cultures. But not every actual circumstance is relevant to realizing rights, and not every circumstance should be preserved. If circumstances, as he says, may be noxious or beneficial, surely we should seek to change or abolish the noxious ones, not to leave them unaltered. So it isn't just circumstances, whatever they may be, that matter. So if we're to consider how rights are to be realized, it's not enough to criticize abstraction. We need to work out which circumstances we actually face at a given time or place, which to preserve or protect, which to ignore, which to try to change. And without understanding why some circumstances must or may be left intact and others changed, Burke's insistence on the importance of circumstances, combined with his hostility to abstract rights, tells us little. It may be perfectly true that we don't aim to give praise or blame to anything which relates to human actions and concerns on a simple view of the object in all the nakedness and solitude of metaphysical abstraction, but surely we do have to be discriminating about circumstances. Indeed, circumstances may be essential for rights, and ignoring them may undermine any attempt to respect or realize rights. Well, which circumstances matter seems to be the next question one might want to answer. In an essay in 1766 opposing the penal laws in Ireland, Burke argued passionately that everybody is satisfied that a conservation and secure enjoyment of our natural rights is the great and ultimate purpose of civil society, and therefore all forms whatsoever of government are only good as they are subservient to that purpose, to which they are entirely subordinate. But we can only tell what means are needed to pursue this great and ultimate purpose in specific circumstances. Which circumstances are relevant and irrelevant now for us? The mere fact that Burke mentions so many circumstances is sometimes a bit discouraging. He, of course, in particular mentions the circumstance of our ancient constitution, law and liberties, accepted views and traditions. But that doesn't show that these are still relevant, let alone essential. Our circumstances are not Burke's circumstances, and we can't simply adopt his claims about what's needed if rights are to be respected and realized. The practical point, then, is surely not to avoid abstraction, but to seek to create or to maintain circumstances that make it possible to reach a determinate and coherent interpretation of rights, and feasible to respect and realize this rights. And this may not best be done by preserving the circumstances that Burke singles out as important. Particular circumstances that struck him as very important, such as that some of our rights have very ancient pedigrees, or that we inherited some of them from our forefathers, seem to me unlikely to be useful, let alone necessary for interpreting or realizing rights. Much that we have inherited may be inadequate, or inadequate in our present circumstances. Parts of that inheritance may be noxious, parts decayed, parts irrelevant. I would contend that realism is indispensable if rights are to be realized, and realism is not merely piety about what we inherit. But I think Burke is also realistic, not anachronistic, in some of his claims about the fundamental circumstances in which rights can be respected and realized. His realism is, in my view, at its clearest when he insists that all realizable rights must have counterpart duties. He wrote, "What is the use of discussing a man's abstract right to food or medicine? The question is upon the method of procuring and administering them. In that deliberation, I shall always advise to call in the aid of the farmer and the physician, rather than the professor of metaphysics." Rights without counterpart duties are, he thinks, illusory. No right can be respected or realized without competent duty bearers who do what's required. Some rights, such as those to food or medicine, or other goods and services, require strenuous action by specified others. Others, liberty rights, may require less strenuous duties, but they demand them of all others. Unless duties are allocated to individuals and to institutions that can discharge them, there can be no effective rights. And here I think he is a bit ahead of some of our thoughts today. Unless duties are allocated to individuals and institutions that are competent to discharge them, there can and will be no effective rights. The striking silence about duties in many contemporary discussions of rights no doubt reflects immense cultural shifts from a world centred on social and cultural tradition and duty to one in which legal requirements and their enforcement by states are seen as fundamental, in which individuals are commonly seen as having rights, but very little is said about their duties. But rights, of course, can't be secured merely by assigning second-order duties to enforce them to states. Somebody's got to shoulder the basic duties, and enforcement's not likely to work unless it's both defined and well understood who ought to do what for whom. So I think the most fundamental circumstance needed for rights to be respected or realized is an adequate degree of shared understanding of what human rights are, or how, more specifically, how we interpret them. The rights are typically declared or listed in the charters and conventions in very abstract language, and it may seem that it should not be hard to reach a shared understanding. It's a common vocabulary, but it may not be a sufficiently penetrating vocabulary. As soon as we consider any specific right at all closely, it becomes evident that it has to be interpreted so as to be consistent with the interpretations of all the other rights. How are rights to freedom of expression to be adjusted to rights to privacy? Think about some of the debates about online abuse. How are rights to freedom to be shaped so that they do not undermine others' rights to security? Think about some of the breaches of security recently. How are rights to food to be secured without undermining many of the rights to work and to property of farmers and of those who store, distribute, prepare, and sell food? How are rights to medicine, to health care, to be secured without undermining many of the rights of physicians and other health care providers? Adequate answers to these questions depend on complex cultural and institutional arrangements, without which these rights indeed remain abstract, perhaps useless. So Burke may have something to tell us, but it's not something simple. I doubt whether it's possible to identify a unique or optimal way of interpreting and configuring the plurality of rights we meet in contemporary declarations and covenants. Even if we're convinced of the importance of human rights standards, we cannot assume that the interpretations and implementations of one time are beyond question and need no revision in another time. Currently favoured ways of adjusting rights to one another may, in the first place, simply not be optimal, or they may be optimal for some circumstances and suboptimal for others. For example, do we think that current interpretation of rights to privacy, for example, the European Data Protection Directive, its national implementations, or the draft Data Protection Regulation, will prove feasible in the face of revolutions in communications, encryption, and data mining technologies? I doubt it. Current interpretations of rights to family life may not prove adequate or even feasible in the face of transformations of family structures. Current interpretations of rights to citizenship, which are often quite closely tied to conceptions of family structure, may not prove adequate if family structures change. The abstract human rights listed in the declarations and covenants may remain widely accepted, but their interpretation, I think, is not likely to be constant or undisputed. Secondly, changes in circumstances may mean that we have to change ways we think of enforcement. Enforcement will fail if there's no realistic view of the actual capacity of those who are to enforce. Current assumptions about enforcement load the task onto the states that have ratified the rights. But states can only discharge the second-order duties to ensure that rights are respected and realized if they have the appropriate capacities. Many of the states that have ratified the covenants of '96 do not have these capacities. Some are failed states, some are rogue states, Some are merely weak states, and they cannot, however diligently and nicely they signed on the dotted line when they ratified the relevant instruments, enforce duties or ensure that rights are respected or realized. That is the sober truth of where we are. Now, in some respects, even well-governed states that secure both order and the rule of law internally now face challenges to enforcement that were quite hard to imagine 50 years ago. The Covenants of 1966 were drafted at a distinctive time at which decolonization was seemingly moving towards completion, but globalization was only beginning. It was, if you will, a Westphalian moment, named for the Peace of Westphalia of 1648, at which it was possible to imagine a future world consisting entirely of sovereign states with well-defined borders and adequate powers to enforce duties to respect and realize human rights within those borders and no responsibilities beyond those borders. It made sense to assume that the states party could and should enforce respect for and realization of rights. Circumstances have, as we know, changed in two relevant respects. First, it's become clearer that some of the emerging states that lack the power or will to enforce the relevant duties lack them not only for a transitional period, while they, so to speak, get up and running, but for a very long and indefinite period. Secondly, the powers of states that are taken to have the will and capacity to secure respect for and realization of rights has been reshaped and sometimes reduced, as that of many non-state actors has grown at the expense of states. The Westphalian moment has passed. Even states with robust laws and a strong commitment of human rights, and I think of the states of northwestern Europe that are familiar to us, can find it hard to secure all rights for all persons. Increasing migration, increasing tax evasion, financial cross-border crime on a large scale, the consequent diminution of state revenues, the offshoring of corporate governance, economic power, all of these and many other facets of our world can reduce and reshape state powers and can reduce and reshape state revenues, so make it harder for states to realize or respect rights, to secure respect for or to realize rights. Globalization, in short, weakens states in certain ways and strengthens non-state actors. This has been recognized both in Kofi Annan's Global Compact initiative and in John Ruggie's report to the United Nations on the Protect, Respect and Remedy framework. Both of these are about assigning more of the duties to powerful non-state actors, in particular powerful transnational corporations. Unsurprisingly, there's now a widespread realization that more of the duties to respect and realize rights may have to be assigned to non-state actors, but the implications of so doing remain, I think, very unclear. Circumstances matter, and changes in circumstances offer reason to rethink human rights and their counterpart duties. Effective rights need a clear interpretation, both of what those rights are and of what their counterpart duties demand. But there's no reason to assume that this will be exactly what currently finds favour, or even, rather a different matter, what currently finds favour among human rights advocates and activists. Effective rights indeed need to be implemented, and part of that implementation will have to be secured by enforcing relevant duties. There's no reason to assume that current patterns of implementation or aspirations to implement are going to remain what they are today. I think I'm going to stop there. I think that though I have some other things to say, I'll say them in the discussion, if you will. Let me just wind up, therefore, by saying I think that Burke did take human rights seriously and their institutionalization, and so do we. But what we're taking seriously is not the circumstances that Burke took seriously. The question that I have for us today is whether we are taking the circumstances in which we're living sufficiently seriously. Is there the same sort of abstraction or possible idealization in fancying that the states can deliver it all and that there's nothing that needs to be said about who else has to carry duties if rights are to be respected and realized. My suspicion is that the states, for the most part, can't begin to carry it all. Some favored states, particularly in our part of the world, carry a great deal of it, but even so, not all. And it would be better, I suspect, if we thought seriously about what the other players can do by way of carrying obligations. Of course, states will have unique capacities to enforce the criminal law. I don't doubt that. But that may not be the only way in which rights are respected or secured. Thank you very much.